Hi, everyone. I'm Alex. I head up an experience design team at Inviqa, and I'm here with Jamie today to talk to you about a very exciting subject, which is designing for memory. Now, as it tends to happen with a lot of things, with a lot of good things, it has been explored before, much before the experience design in traditional sense as we know it existed. One of the greatest explorers of memory and creating for memories, in my view, is Italo Calvino, who has this beautiful saying in his novel Invisible Cities. What he says is, between each idea and each point of the itinerary, an affinity or contrast can be established, serving as immediate aid to memory. What a beautiful, simple, yet powerful idea that we build our relationship with experiences based on either affinity or contrast, perhaps with our expectations. Let's talk about designing for memory. So at the end of this story, hopefully, you may or may not learn the secrets to designing the best museum experience in the world, the formula. It starts from a personal story, and that story is going to be about beauty, because beauty was exactly what I was thinking when I was walking the corridors of the National Museum of Cinema in Turin. Look at it. Its absolute and stunning beauty is something that captured my memory and kept itself within my memory for ages. Now that I think about it, it's over 10 years that I've been there. So why is it that it was such a memorable experience to me? Well, one of the first things that I can say about it is that there was an unexpected contrast between the shell of the museum and the content. Look at the tower, look at how it dominates the landscape. And by looking at it, you can almost imagine things that are on the inside, or you feel you could perhaps imagine, because the tower's architecture dictates what you may expect. But actually, museum surprises you completely. It is empty, it defies its own geometry on the inside, and it offers you a completely different take on its space. Second thing that really stuck in my memory and really captured my attention was that singular narrative that the person visiting the museum goes through. So it's a linear journey connecting the museum from the beginnings of the cinema, like stroboscope disc and other animation toys, pre-movie, really pre-film narrative, into the most, and at the top of the tower, you have the most recent movies, the most recent narrative, cinematic narrative, which is a really great linear experience. And a third thing that really that is really memorable about it was multiple ways to read the space. So by the point that I was very comfortable or fairly comfortable with exploring the museum, I've noticed and started noticing a lot of doors, passages, tiny little secrets that can be explored in order to start building up my own take of the museum. So a lot of shortcuts within the experience. Moreover, it had this elevator in the middle of this space that enabled a completely different view of the museum. By raising to the top of it, you could see everything from there and have a completely different perspective. So it was vertical, spiral, horizontal. At the same time, it was quite stunning, really, and quite an amazing experience. So if we are to derive people-centric design principles from this singular experience that I've described, we would perhaps say the first principle was around surprise. So surprising me, that contrast between the shell and the content made it, but it could be a different surprising element. Second one is taking me on a journey. So it was a truly linear narrative from the beginning to the end of the museum experience. And a third one was around allowing me to create my own narrative. So in a way, contribute to being the creator in the space of the museum, which is a really amazing feeling to have. So then, once upon a time, we had a dream brief, which was to imagine a museum, or to be precise, to ask people what kind of museum they would like to see exist. Now, we thought to ourselves, how do we research something that doesn't exist yet without succumbing to our own experience-led biases around it? It was an amazing project, but what we had to absolutely nail and understand was the methodology and the process to approach it in the right way. So there were four core parts in it. The first one was choosing the method. So what type of research works best for our context, which is exploring a thing that doesn't exist yet. Secondly, it was defining the audiences and people we were going to talk to. So who the client says we should be talking to versus who we should actually be talking to, and widening our net and understanding the nature of the future space. Third one was conversation design. So if I were to ask you a direct question about your future, it's very possible that you will give me a lot of answers, and also very, very possible that you won't actually answer the question around what are your true needs. So we had to design it in a very careful way, in a way coming back to the past rather than tapping into the future. And the fourth one was interpretation and playback. So this is very much around defining the design principles of the Museum of the Future. So what methods did we choose? We chose a mixture of qual and quant methods when venturing into this unknown space. We did some social listening as well as surveys. We also did a lot of conversations with different groups of people. Who were those different groups of people? Now, the interesting thing is that most of museums we found are very much designed for subject matter experts. I mean, there is an intrinsic assumption that you should be interested in the space, and the space sometimes is treated as self-explanatory. Well, it's actually really not true in terms of the opportunity. We have tourists who are highly influenced by circumstances and environment where they are, where this activity fits in their daily schedule and space. We also have local people that develop a relationship with museum over time and are also very, very important part of the audience to think of. What did we ask these people? Well, we framed the questions around two key areas. And we could say this was, the positive memory and the negative memory. So it was very much around creating the most, what are the most memorable attractions and travel experiences that people have come across, and what terminology is used to describe them. So we really listened carefully to the conversation, trying to extract people's own terminology. And the second one, was around the negative experiences. So what is the most terrible experience you have ever had when exploring something new? And we've asked people to, again, unfortunately, relive the experience that they had and tell us about it. So in that way, we almost created a time machine to explore the memory space in order to design for the future. Now, how did we interpret what people said? We found a lot of very interesting things in different areas, and it would take me another talk to go through all the findings. But a few highlights of what we found was quite astonishing. Different audiences had very different expectations from the space. So while subject matter experts were very much ready to enjoy the space, and one of the key detractors for them would be crowds. For the tourists and anyone who wasn't perhaps directly considering venturing into the museum, the variability of detractors increased drastically. So we had anything from inconvenient location to kind of time in the day that it would be open, to a variety of things that they would find to kind of not do the experience. So we had to work with it to establish what was the model for both audiences. Subject matter experts expected immersive reality, whilst other people and people who are less interested were considering the value that they're really getting from the museum, and understanding, of inside souvenirs, otherwise value that it brings to their life, in a way increasing the need for tangible learning from the space. So we looked at things like controlled flow for certain types of audiences, which is batch entry, opportunity of early hours entry, and journey saturation markers, where we have too many people in certain areas and how we could deload it. By the way, this was pre-current crisis, which is really interesting to see a lot of these things being now implemented in different spaces. We looked at continuous flow of experience for the audiences that were not primarily interested, and looking at grouping it with other cultural attractions, working on various entry and exit points, enabling people to craft their own narrative, making the transport links an integral part of the experience. We also looked at the nature of the experiences and how they should play out to different types of customers. So saturated and longer experiences for subject matter experts that are willing to be immersed into the narrative completely, and a shorter, snappier experiences that are really highlighting the cultural aspect and the value that people are getting from visiting the place for different kinds of audiences. We also had an unexpected moment where a lot of people talked to us about the importance of the relaxing aspect of the experience to them, no matter what this is, a museum, a new place. So we found it quite surprising, and we thought that, again, there can be services provided to facilitate that, or how do we enable the museum to partner with businesses who will market them as an intense experience within perhaps a range of other experiences. So in terms of the flow, that was quite revealing. Weirdly, if we think about all the things we found, they map really well into the initial principles, into the understanding of, surprising a customer. So when they least expect that, taking people on a journey in a linear way, enabling that controlled or continuous flow of the experience, and allowing people to create their own narrative where we talk about the nature of experiences, the saturation, or perhaps the shorter nature of experiences. These principles, in turn, lend themselves really well to a framework that can be applied to both digital and physical experiences in our view. And the framework is relatively simple. The first part of it is really around triggering and tapping into the sense of surprise. So providing that connection to a personal reaction that in turn triggers memory. Second part of it was very much around leading with a clear narrative through space, so people are able to follow that story, and that journey creates familiarity. And the third part of the framework was very much around empowerment. So it's allowing people to craft their own narratives too, and be creator of those spaces, and allowing the interpretation and creativity. And some of the aspects can be dialed up and down based on the space and the intent of the space. The most beautiful part of this story and this framework is that it is to be later used in design, and we're still exploring how we can successfully use it whilst applying it to both digital and physical channels. And I'll hand you over to Jamie, who is going to talk about designing for memory in the aspect of emotional peaks.
Thank you, Aleks. Hi everyone, I'm Jamie Stantonian, and I'm an experience lead at Inviqa, and I wanted to talk to you about another project in the cultural heritage sector which revolves around designing for memorability. Last year I worked with the Imperial War Museums to help their transformation into a customer-centric organisation. This began with a deep dive into their world, with interviewing staff and arranging workshops with people from across the organisation, reviewing customer service feedback and TripAdvisor reviews, and also identifying what they were currently measuring in terms of KPIs and other metrics. We played this back in a series of experience maps, which performed a number of functions. Firstly, they helped us piece together a holistic view of how different parts of the organisation impacted the customer experience, not always positively. And it helped us see how different projects and initiatives could be aligned. Also, we assembled a shared vision of an idealised customer experience, from the moment someone had the idea to visit to the days and months after, though with a focus on the museum visit itself. And once we'd decided what this vision was, we needed to come up with a way to measure it. But this posed the question, what does it mean to measure an experience? What do we mean when we talk about experience? And furthermore, how do we create a framework that measures what really matters to people, but is also simple enough to implement without becoming onerous? In thinking about the best way to approach this, I kept on thinking back to a comment I found in the customer feedback. The feedback was, the worst bacon sandwich of my life. Now this comment really stuck with me. Was the sandwich really that bad? Or was something else going on? We're talking about museums that are packed with war memorabilia, tanks, spy gear, jets, rockets. They're very exciting places. So it's interesting that a dodgy sandwich is a thing that stuck with him and he decided to put in the review. So why is this? The answer could lie in the work of Nobel-winning psychologist Daniel Kahneman, particularly around what he called the peak end rule. Based on his experimental work, the peak end rule rests on the idea that a recollection of an experience is a narrative that we piece together around key moments. These fragments represent the emotional peaks, both good and bad, and what happens at the end of that experience. Problematically, for those of us who design experiences, negative ones are remembered more strongly than positive ones. And because emotion is fundamentally entangled with the formation of memories, one negative event can spoil an otherwise pleasant day out. For instance, I still recall a holiday from Tunisia 12 years ago, both in terms of the nightmarish queue at the airport and the joy of finding fossils up in the Atlas Mountains. Kahneman explains that when it comes to experience, we're actually talking about two things, because we have two selves. We have our experiencing self, which is the eternal here and now, emotionally entangled with its environment, and then the remembering or narrative self, who pieces together the story to make sense of the overall experience, both to ourselves and to others. This is made more interesting by the fact that the memory of this initial experience is hardly crystalline to begin with, but is open to alteration and bias each time we recollect it. In fact, psychologist Bruce Hood compares memory to a compost heap in a state of constant reorganization. He continued by saying, just like garden refuse that you put in a compost heap, experiences are laid down with the most recent still retaining much detail and structure, but, with time, they eventually break down and become mixed and integrated with the rest of our experiences. Indeed, some of the pioneering experiments by the psychologist Ulrich Neisser about the Challenger shuttle disaster found that people's memories of the event could be totally false, made up of fragments of what other people had told them and things they'd seen on the television. Our memories are stories, and the more we recollect them or share them, we're actually overwriting them and amending them based on the emotional or dramatic needs of the moment. Thus, an underwhelming sandwich spoiling a day out becomes magnified to become one of the worst experiences of our lives. So these are the troughs, but what about the positives? What are the peaks of experience in the Imperial War Museum? Luckily, we had a strong steer on this. Very early on we were told that our museum is about stories, and the rest of our interviews and research, especially with the passionate and knowledgeable volunteers and front stage staff, corroborated this. The rave reviews left by customers were often about the stories they'd been told about the exhibits, the emotional lightning strike in which inanimate objects are imbued with meaning. Nor was this all one way. Sometimes visitors come to draw meaning from sharing their own stories with staff and volunteers, of ordeals and adventures had by their parents or grandparents, and in telling these stories they make this connection and add to the collective knowledge of the museum. One museum employee told me, holding back tears, a story from the 1920s when a woman gave the IWM a photo of her only son who'd died during the Great War, and it was the only image she had of him. This was from a time when photography was still prohibitively expensive for many, but she reasoned it was better for the museum to share his story rather than have it die with her. It's these sparks of human connection that stick with people and their museum experience. What we needed to do then was create a way to measure the experience of these two separate selves. First, we developed an on-site survey that could be completed with a few taps in an attempt to capture as best we can the experiencing self. Then, importantly, at the end we'd ask them if they made a personal connection with a story or exhibit in the museum, and I'll come back to this later. This survey, which we piloted in January, would form the basis of a customer experience score which covers the primary domains of the visit. These were orientation and wayfinding, both getting to and navigating within the museum, then the service experience, covering retail, dining, state of the loos, and so on, and finally what we called the core experience, whether the trip met their expectations, expectations being anticipations of future memories in Kahneman's terms, how they rated the experience from forgettable to unforgettable, and also the net promoter score. Here you can see concept art, if you like, of what the score would consist of, but version 1 is in Excel and looks a bit less glamorous than this. Now, I mentioned earlier that we asked one question around whether the visitor made a personal connection to an exhibit or story in the Imperial War Museum. Now, this was a binary yes or no question, so we decided not to include it in the score itself, but rather we used it to separate the data. And when you begin to do this, something very interesting happens. When people respond in the affirmative, that they did make a personal connection, all of the other metrics related to service experience and wayfinding are also elevated. Now we need to be cautious, because this was a pilot and the sample size was not enormous, but it could be early evidence that creating these powerful moments can alter the perception of the whole experience, and therefore the visitor's future memories. As for how we design in a way to create these memories, or increase the probability that we can create them, we first need to look at the physical environment itself. Like the National Museum of Cinema in Turin, the vision for the Imperial War Museum London is also around having a narrative, starting at the bottom with World War I and going upwards towards more recent conflicts. However, there was a small problem. Because the redevelopment of the Imperial War Museum is phased, the new entrance to the World War I floor has not yet been completed, and shan't be for a few years, and this has led to a cascade of consequences that have impacted the visitor experience. Because when visitors have to come in the old entrance on the ground floor, they then have to come down 2 flights of stairs and get to the reception and the First World War galleries. However, when visitors enter via this main entrance, they may end up wandering into the bookshops for a nose, and then from here end up accidentally somewhere in the middle of World War II. For those who do descend the stairs and end up in the atrium but have not yet made it to the reception desk, it's often not clear where best to begin, and it's easy to get distracted by the exhibits. So, to compensate for this confusion, volunteers are asked to huddle in the atrium and the entrance to assist in wayfinding, and this in turn means they are far from most of the exhibits, where they would otherwise be talking to visitors and enabling meaningful exchanges of stories. As such, amongst our recommendations was to reallocate volunteers and position them where there would be a higher probability of creating these memorable experiences. Similarly, we recommended the adoption of new cultural practices and tools to enable the flow of information and stories throughout the organisation. The hope is that increasing the likelihood of these wow moments to occur by reallocating staff and volunteers will compensate for wayfinding shortcomings when the visitor looks back on their experience in the future. In this way, designing for memory ultimately comes down to designing how information flows within an organisation and the manner in which it reaches the customer, both through modern means and new technology and through old-fashioned adoption of cultural practices. And while I could talk about this project all day, I now hand you back to Aleks for the wrap-up.
Thank you all for listening to us. And we're very happy to take any questions. Feel free to share your thoughts with us in the upcoming Q&A.